Probably you know the Universal Service Directive, because the past many years we've communicated about this legislation. Well, you can forget about it, because soon the main legislative text about emergency calls in Europe will be called the European Electronic Communications Code. You can just call it the EECC, or even the codes. If you're in Brussels and working on this, it's just the codes. So what is the EECC? So first of all, it's the new EU legislation on telecoms. So it's not only 112, but it's actually a very big legislative piece. Many pages in the proposal, but it's all about telecommunications in the European Union. It replaces the Universal Service Directive. So in a few months, when this will be voted, the Universal Service Directive will no longer exist. So we will just stop speaking about that. It will just be for the history books. And it's the main EU legislation on emergency calls, as I said. And important to say that it's a directive. Directive means that once voted, it needs to be, let's say, translated into the national law of the member state. So the implementation will also take some time, and there will be a room for maneuver for the member states to implement the provisions in the proposal. So just a small briefing about the EU decision-making. So there are three main institutions in the EU. First one is the European Commission. It's those who prepare the legislation and implement it afterwards. Then when it comes about voting the legislation, we have the European Parliament, which represents the citizens of the European Union. The members of the Parliament are directly elected by the citizens of the EU. And then there's the Council that represents the member states. So those two institutions, the Parliament and the Council, have to vote the proposal that is done by the European Commission, and they can amend the text, so they can add some provisions in the proposal from the Commission. So, as you now understand, all started in the ECC with the European Commission, which proposed a new text on the 14th of September 2016 with the Article 102, which is the main article on 112, so not to mix it. Then, as you just heard, it's the turn of the Parliament and the Council to bring some changes to the proposal of the European Commission. So first, the Parliament brought some changes over the past year. So you see from December 2016 to October last year, so it took a certain time to work on the text properly, to examine it and vote the amendments. The votes on the amendments was done in September last year. So basically, what does it include for 112, the votes of the European Parliament? We have the improvement of the caller location information for emergency calls by using handset-derived location information. So that's kind of AML, but that also opens the possibility to other technologies. But we just here speak about handset-derived location information. There's also the introduction of a reverse 112 system that was voted by the European Parliament, the establishment of a transnational database to tackle the issue of transnational emergency calls. I guess you're familiar with this. And there's a mandate of a direct access to 112, even from private networks, so for instance from the hotel and so on. So that was the vote of the Parliament. So this is not the definitive version. Just to show you the text of what was voted, this is about caller location. So you see that the proposal said that emergency calls should be located, and what was added is that they should be located also using handset-derived location information. Some public warning provisions has been introduced. I will not go a lot through this because this will not be the final text. This is just what was voted by the Parliament. You see also the provisions on transnational emergency calls and on direct access to 112, especially from private networks. So that's pretty good, right? Well, just don't forget that we still have the Council, actually, that also have to vote those amendments. And actually, the Council, in its position that was voted in October, so they worked more or less at the same time as the Parliament, they did not include those amendments, so that's less good, let's say. So this led to some, let's say, disagreements that needs to be tackled. So for this, there is a procedure that is called a trialogue. So it's the meeting of those three institutions to try to find agreements. And here the role of the Commission is also very important because they do not decide, but they help finding an agreement and finding a suitable wording that is also applicable in terms of law, I would say. So there were a couple of trialogues that were organized, so more or less one per month since October, and you see that there was one that happened 2 days ago, so just to try to find agreements on the many disagreements that there were between the Parliament and the Council. So basically, what is the situation at the moment? I speak here under the control of VESA, who is following the trialogues for the European Commission. But basically, on co-location, we can say that an agreement has been reached between the Parliament and the Council to include handset-derived location information to the EU legislation. So that's a very good news. On public warning, let's say the institutions are still working on a suitable wording and as to the scope of the provisions, but I can say already that there will be something on reverse 112 in the EU legislation. So now the discussions are about whether we include national apps in the scope of the mandate or not, but I guess VESA will tell us better a bit later. And transnational database, an agreement has been found, so there will be a provision on this in the final text, and on direct access to 112, there are still some discussions around a suitable wording too, and to try to overcome the issues raised by the member states. So not only this, but many other provisions have been voted on emergency calls. So for instance, on the accessibility for deaf and hard of hearing citizens, so like what technologies do we use? So this is already under discussion between the EU institutions, and also there are some discussions on the access to 112 from the number-based OTTs and the number-independent online platforms. So those are the discussions that are ongoing also about like access to 112 and who should give access to 112. So now you know more or less everything about the European Electronic Communications Code. Just before we start the discussion, I'd like also to mention the e-privacy regulation. So that's also something that is being discussed at the moment. And why is this relevant? It's because, I mean, you all have issues, I guess, with privacy when handling the emergency call. And this is the main, one of the two main legislation on privacy in the European Union, along with the GDPR, we can say. So this replaced a directive that was existing since 2002. So I guess it needs some time also to be a bit more modernized. This is a regulation, so it's not a directive, the new text. A regulation means that it does not need to be translated into the national laws. So that means that once voted, it will be applicable directly in all the member states with no further national law that is needed. And why it is important is that there's an exception in the proposal for the emergency services to process and to receive the caller location information without asking for the consent of the person calling the emergency services. So then the discussions are about what do we mean here by caller location and by emergency services. But now the Council is basically adding, so the Council is the member states, and what is at stake now is that they are adding a provision to make sure that handset-derived location is also in the scope of the exemption. So basically, this is how it looks like, and I want to thank the Commission also for their help on the wording in the paragraph 3 especially, so you see that it is clear now that handset-derived location information will be in the scope for the exemption of the emergency services of privacy rules, let's say. So now you master as well the privacy regulation. So we are almost done. Just to mention the next steps. So we still have to wait for the end of the legislative procedure about the EECC and the e-privacy regulation. It's taking a bit of time to find agreement on all the provisions, but I hope that it will be voted by the end of the year. And then we will wait for the implementation of the provisions as well, and this will be to follow, and it will be the role of the Commission to make sure that the text is well implemented across the European Union. And finally, there might be some further legislative framework on emergency caller location that shall be announced quite soon. So I guess that's it for my presentation.